His name does not appear in the standard histories of 19th-century surgery. It does not appear in the proceedings of the Royal College of Surgeons, nor in the index of the British Medical Journal from 1871 to 1889, the years he was most active. If you search for Dr. Ambrose Crail in the catalogued records of the Edinburgh Medical Society, you will find a single entry, a brief administrative note from 1882 acknowledging the receipt of a paper he submitted for publication. There is no record of that paper ever being printed. There is no record of it being rejected. It simply stops existing after that single line of acknowledgement, as if it walked into the archive and quietly sat down and never stood back up. What Ambrose Crail found inside the body of a 7-foot 2-inch man named Thomas Doyle during a surgical procedure in the spring of 1881 would not be formally described by any other physician for another 23 years. When it finally was, the man who described it received international acclaim, multiple honorary degrees, and a legacy so thoroughly enshrined in the history of modern neurosurgery that his name is still taught in every medical school in the English-speaking world. Ambrose Crail received nothing. He was asked, in terms his own letters describe as courteous but entirely without ambiguity, to stop talking, and he did, because he had a practice and a family and a career he had spent 2 decades building, and because he understood, with the particular clarity that comes from being shown a document you were not supposed to see, that the institution he was arguing against was older and more patient than he was. This is the story of what he found, and why the people above him needed it to disappear. To understand the stakes of what Crail was attempting to do, you need to understand what medical science in 1881 believed about giants, which is to say, almost nothing that was clinically useful. The phenomenon of extreme human height had been observed and catalogued throughout history, but it had never been explained in any mechanistic sense. What the medical establishment of the 19th century offered instead of explanation was classification. Giants were documented the way unusual insects were documented, measured, sketched, given Latin descriptors, and filed away as anomalies rather than patients. The question of what biological process inside the human body could produce a man of 7 feet was not considered a serious avenue of surgical or physiological investigation. It was considered, in the language of the era, a curiosity of nature, something to observe, not something to understand. This intellectual climate had already produced, a full century before Crail, one of the most disgraceful episodes in the history of British medicine. And understanding that episode is essential to understanding what happened to his paper. His name was Charles Byrne. He was known across London and Ireland as the Irish Giant. He stood 7 feet and 7 inches tall. He was born in 1761 in County Londonderry, the son of entirely ordinary-sized parents, in a part of Ireland that researchers would not understand until the 21st century, a region carrying an unusually high concentration of a specific genetic mutation that disrupts the body's ability to regulate growth hormone at the level of the pituitary gland. Byrne spent the short years of his adult life as a paid spectacle in London venues, where the public came to stand beside him and feel the vertigo of encountering the apparent outer limit of human scale. He was celebrated, and he was lonely, and he died in 1783 at the age of 22, almost certainly from a condition that today would be diagnosed, treated, and managed before it had the chance to kill him. He left behind one explicit and clearly stated dying wish: that his body be buried at sea, weighted down and lowered into water deep enough that no one could reach it. He had watched London long enough to know what happened to the bodies of the unusual once they stopped drawing crowds. He wanted, at minimum, the dignity of being left alone after death. The surgeon who ignored that wish was John Hunter, one of the most celebrated anatomists in British history, a man whose collections and contributions to medical knowledge are foundational in every serious sense of that word, and a man who paid associates to intercept Burns' coffin before it reached the docks, and swapped the body inside for rocks. He kept the skeleton hidden in his home for years, displaying it only after sufficient time had passed that the protests of Burns' friends had exhausted themselves. That skeleton is still in London today, at the Hunterian Museum at the Royal College of Surgeons, exhibited in a glass case. The ongoing ethical debate about whether it should be buried according to the man's recorded final wishes has never been conclusively settled. John Hunter never published a detailed clinical account of what he observed when he disassembled Charles Byrne. His records were meticulous on matters of measurement: bone length, joint width, density, the proportions of the skull, but entirely silent on the question that mattered most. He never described what he found, or didn't find, or looked at and didn't recognize in the softer structures. The architecture inside a body that had grown that far beyond ordinary parameters. Either he didn't examine the right places, or he didn't know what he was looking at, or he made a different decision entirely, for reasons his private papers do not explain. That silence is the room Ambrose Crail walked into. Crail had trained in Edinburgh and done his clinical years in London before establishing his practice in Glasgow in the early 1870s. He was regarded by his colleagues as technically exceptional and temperamentally unusual in the particular way that sometimes produces either brilliance or catastrophic professional self-destruction. He was constitutionally incapable of accepting an explanation that didn't fully account for what he was observing. He had published 3 well-received papers before 1880 on subjects unrelated to what would eventually consume him. He was building, steadily and carefully, the kind of institutional standing that takes a decade to construct and can be lost in a single season. Thomas Doyle arrived at his practice in the winter of 1880. He was 31 years old, a laborer from County Clare, who had been working the mills outside of Glasgow for 6 years. He had been referred not because of his height, though his height was impossible to ignore from the moment he entered a room, but because of the headaches. They had been worsening for 2 years without clear explanation. By the time he sat in Crail's examination room, they were frequent and severe enough that he had largely stopped working. He described them, in terms Crail recorded in his case notes, as pressure rather than pain. Not a stabbing or a throbbing, but the sustained and escalating sense of something pushing outward from directly behind both eyes simultaneously. Crail examined him across 3 separate sessions in December of 1880 and January of 1881. He noted the proportions of Doyle's face, the enlarged jaw, the progressive thickening of the brow ridge. The hands that Doyle himself reported had grown measurably wider and heavier in the past 4 years. He noted that his symptoms had worsened in a continuous and progressive pattern, rather than appearing suddenly or fluctuating, which eliminated several common explanations. He noted the specific location of the pressure Doyle described. And he noted something that the physicians Doyle had seen previously had not apparently considered worth documenting. Doyle reported that his growth had not stopped at adolescence. He was still growing, slowly, incrementally, but measurably, at 31 years old. What Crail came to believe by the end of that third session was that the engine of Thomas Doyle's condition was not distributed across his body, but concentrated at a single anatomical point. That the mechanism producing everything, the height, the altered proportions, the pressure, the unceasing growth, could be physically located inside the man's skull. He proposed surgery. Doyle agreed without apparent hesitation. He had, by his own account, nothing much left to lose. The headaches had already taken his work and his sleep, and most of his functional life. The procedure Crail performed in April of 1881 was, by the standards of his era, operating at the absolute frontier of what was technically possible. Cranial surgery in the 1880s was regarded by most physicians as nearly tantamount to a death sentence for the patient. The infection risk alone made most surgeons refuse to attempt it. Doyle survived. He was ambulatory within 3 weeks. He was discharged from Crail's care 8 weeks after the procedure. He returned to Ireland. What became of the rest of his life is not recorded anywhere that has been found. What Crail found when he opened Thomas Doyle's skull was a tumor growing from a structure at the base of the brain so small and so poorly understood in 1881 that most physicians of the era could not have told you its name with confidence, let alone its function. The pituitary gland. It is approximately the size of a pea. It sits in a small bony hollow at the center of the skull, suspended from the brain above it by a thin stalk of tissue. It is, in the language of every endocrinology textbook written in the century that followed, the master gland, the central regulatory mechanism through which the human body controls the production and release of growth hormone. A tumor growing within it, or compressing it from the outside, can cause the body to produce growth hormone in quantities that normal physiology never generates. Over years and decades, that continuous hormonal flood can make a person enormous. It thickens bone. It expands cartilage. It enlarges the jaw and the brow and the hands and the feet in a slow and cumulative process that, if you encounter only its end result and not its mechanism, can look like a different category of human being rather than what it actually is. A malfunction in a gland the size of a pea, sitting in the dark at the center of the skull, producing the wrong amount of a single chemical. Crail removed the tumor. He documented his observations in precise clinical language. He described the growth, its location, its apparent relationship to the surrounding tissue, and his reconstruction of the causal chain connecting it to every symptom and physical characteristic Thomas Doyle presented with across a lifetime. He wrote a paper that, in the retrospect that Harvey Cushing's later work would provide, was correct in all its essential claims. He submitted it to the Edinburgh Medical Society in the spring of 1882. He received the acknowledgement note. The paper went nowhere. In a letter to a colleague in Dublin, dated November of 1882, preserved in a private family archive and published for the first time in a Scottish medical history journal in 1971, Crail described what happened next. 2 senior figures in the British medical establishment visited his Glasgow practice. He does not name them and appears to have made a deliberate choice not to. They told him, in terms he described as entirely professional and entirely unambiguous, that his paper would not be published, that his conclusions exceeded his evidence, that the implications of his argument, were they to circulate publicly, could produce unnecessary alarm about the stability of the human body's regulatory systems, that he should consider the matter resolved. And then they showed him a document. He does not describe it in detail in the letter. He says only that it suggested plainly that his was not the first such finding, and that others before him had arrived at the same understanding and been asked, with equal courtesy, to set it aside. He says he spent 3 weeks deciding what to do with that information. And then, because he had a practice and a family and a professional standing that 2 decades of careful work had built, he set it aside as he was asked. He continued practicing medicine until 1901. He published nothing further on pituitary function, on gigantism, on the surgical cases that had led him to what he found. He died in Glasgow in 1909. His professional papers were donated to the University of Glasgow Library by his daughter in 1934. A portion of them remain in the archive, catalogued but largely unexamined by medical historians, who have found no reason to look for a man whose name does not appear in the standard histories. In 1909, the same year Ambrose Crail died, Harvey Cushing began publishing his foundational work on pituitary tumors and their relationship to gigantism and acromegaly. He described, in landmark papers that transformed the field of neurosurgery, the precise mechanism that Crail had identified in a Glasgow operating theatre 28 years earlier. By 1930, it was settled science. By 1950, it was introductory coursework. Today, it is the kind of knowledge that medical students absorb in their first year and rarely think about again, because it is so completely, obviously, foundationally understood. Harvey Cushing is remembered as one of the giants of modern neurosurgery. The irony of that word is its own kind of comment. There is a version of this story in which the men who visited Crail's practice were simply products of their era, cautious physicians protecting an institution that moved slowly by design, suspicious of conclusions that arrived ahead of the evidence base those institutions required before accepting them. That version is probably, in most of its details, the accurate one. Medicine has always moved this way. The graveyard of correct ideas that arrived too early is crowded, and most of the headstones carry the names of people who were not suppressed by conspiracy, but by the ordinary and recognizable human impulse to protect what has been built from the turbulence of what isn't yet understood. But that document stays with me, the one suggesting he was not the first. Because if it said what Crail understood it to say, if other surgeons before him had opened similar patients, found the same structure, drawn the same conclusion, and been shown to the same door, then what existed was not an isolated act of institutional caution, but a pattern, a sequence of independent, correct findings, each one absorbed by the same silence, each one arriving at the same answer and being handed the same polite instruction to leave it alone. Not a conspiracy, something more mundane, and in some ways more disturbing. An institution that had learned, over a long enough period, that certain kinds of correctness were more disruptive than it was willing to absorb, and had developed, without formal policy or recorded decision, a quiet reflex from making them disappear. Charles Burns' skeleton is still in a glass case in London. The paper Ambrose Crail wrote has not been located in the University of Glasgow archive, despite the catalogue entry confirming its donation. The names of the men who visited his practice in 1882 and showed him proof that he was not the first have never been identified. What he found inside Thomas Doyle was the engine of giants, a pea-sized malfunction generating a human life that the medicine of his era could see but not explain, that the public of his era could exhibit but not understand, that the institution of his era was apparently willing to go to considerable trouble to keep unexplained for as long as possible. He found it. He described it. He was asked to close the door and act as if he had never opened it. He was 63 years old when Harvey Cushing published the paper that confirmed everything. Whether he read it, and what he felt if he did, is one of the questions his surviving archive has not answered. The door he opened in 1881 is now the entrance to an entire wing of modern medicine. His name is not on it.